Well, hello. I'm Tom Foster, and welcome to potentially the dullest hour of your adult life. Um, I want to get right up front and say that this is a fairly simple technique that I'm going to demonstrate here. It's a fairly simple principle and does not necessarily merit an hour's worth of commentary, but just the video alone without any commentary at all probably wouldn't be all that helpful. So I'm appearing now to help explain what's going on in the images. But the odds are that after I don't know 5 minutes, things may go drastically downhill as I start to run out of things and new things to say. But we'll see how it goes. I do have some questions prepped from other people, which will hopefully add some kind of relevance to the further discussion. But I suppose for the moment I should comment on what's going on screen. I've opened here in Daz Studio, which is a usually free piece of software to use, posing software typically. I've opened, sorry, I've got a little bit of allergy. I've opened an asset called Urban Sprawl, the Big City 2, which is one of their assets that you could purchase from their store. The software itself is free, but most of the 3D models and everything have to be purchased. But all the lighting options and things, or at least the basic ones, come as standard with the package, as do a couple of figures. Sorry, that sounds like I'm the spokesperson for DAS 3D, but this is the software that I use, and I'm just trying to sort of give you a very vague overview of it, so that you don't enter into it completely unwittingly if you do decide to use it. If you are downloading it, you will get some things with the package, but things like this, the Cityscape bundle, this is something that has to be bought. Anyway, I being a comic book artist by trade, I can justify the investment in some of these models, and have done so here. And it's basically, I mean, it's a cityscape. You can pose, you can move the buildings, and obviously move the camera. That's another thing that's built into DAZ. Um, Sorry, and you can therefore, decide your composition and layout of the primary aspects of your image before you even lay pencil to paper, and that's what I tend to do. In this instance, there's very little actual penciling involved because most of the background elements are sort of just basic 3D geometry. They don't really require a huge amount of embellishment, but I do still go in and clean up some of the lines and things in Photoshop. Typically, if I was doing this for an actual comic book, I would ink everything by hand, and maybe repencil a few things here and there. But this is for sort of instructional purposes, and not specifically for inking technique, so that's not really necessary. Now, the question I suppose that I'm answering in this tutorial is about depicting skyscrapers, cityscapes directly from above, and it's a technique that you don't tend to see too much in comics. You see it sometimes in films, but it's usually a pan. Usually, if you see a direct overhead shot of a city, you're panning up a street or over the tops of buildings and things, and that helps to give a sense of sort of momentum and depth to everything. Whereas in a still shot, shooting directly overhead can seem a bit kind of static, a bit uninteresting, potentially even a bit confusing, because depending on, like, if you're shooting from this kind of height and with this kind of lens size, if you like, you can't even really necessarily discern that they're buildings, because all you're seeing is the rooftop in sort of very basic detail. But in this instance, we've got a street, so that helps us, and we're also the camera is placed low enough that the sides of the buildings are also visible. And what I'm illustrating with this first example is just that if you use the default camera setting in DAZ Studio, which is a 65mm sort of virtual lens, it can, for wide angle shots like these, it can look a little bit flat and uninteresting. This might be alright in a film if you were panning up the street. Even then, you would probably use something more along the lines of, I don't know, I'm not a filmmaker, maybe something along the lines of a 30mm, something like that. Maybe a little bigger. Just to give a sense of scale to everything. At the moment, the skyscrapers look a bit sort of stumpy, and the street does not appear to be particularly dwarfed by them, which may be the intention of using this shot. I would say with a shot like this, if you're doing like seeing skyscrapers from overhead, it's not a natural way to view things really. It's a fairly unnatural shot choice. And that being the case, to justify using it, you kind of have to have a specific reason. You can't just do it because you think, oh, that'll look interesting. Something being interesting, things that tend not to be just interesting for the sake of being interesting. There usually have to be a reason to be there for them to be particularly interesting. And so, if you're showing a shot like this from directly overhead, it could be, to show the traffic, to show the sort of imposing nature of the skyscrapers in relation to the traffic, to show that the cars, whoever's peopling them, may be very vulnerable in this situation, or that the people, or that they could be prone to attack from any direction. In which case, a more wide-angle lens, which translates to a smaller lens size. So this, I think, is, what have I moved on to now? I think maybe this is something like a 20mm, something like that. This is very extreme. This is quite sort of vertigo-inducing. This would be to suggest not just that the cars were vulnerable. This would be more about suggesting the height at which the camera is placed. So this might be for a character who's being, held out of a window, or on top of a building, and sort of reeling at being so high up. So the threat of falling is maybe more what's being implied here, and sort of dizzying heights. So that's all a consideration. The previous lens size was like I say, more about suggesting dominance in the architecture as opposed to the citizenry. And now I'm actually changing where the camera is placed in order to take emphasis off of that one street and place it maybe more on the buildings, or just the general sort of bustle of city life. And this is maybe more in line with the kind of shot that you would see if it was just an establishing shot in a movie or something. You'd be panning across the city. And in a comic, you might be able to get away with it by showing both sides of the street and everything. Apologies for that noise in the background if you heard it. But I forgot to mute my monitor. I've got my Facebook open on. But there is a reason why I've got my Facebook open. It's not purely because I don't want to give my undivided attention to this commentary. Quite the opposite. In fact, that's where I will be gleaning my questions to be answered later on in the commentary. So stay tuned for that. You're in for a hell of a treat, no doubt. But now that I've got my sort of 4 main shots, 100% sure what I'm doing at this point. Maybe changing the architecture around a little bit in order to, in order to get that wider shot with all the buildings in it and everything. You know what? This bit, I think maybe it'll be because one of the wide angle shots I wanted to use, I wasn't happy with it for whatever reason. I think maybe there wasn't because I was using such a wide angle lens. It was making quite clear that there weren't, in fact, buildings in the background. It was a fairly limited 3D model that sort of cut off at a certain point. So here I'm just moving the architecture around a bit so it actually fills up that dead space in the image. You won't really see the effects of that until I go back to the other camera. But I mean, it's not really that important. It's the kind of thing that if you were doing this yourself, you'd figure out fairly quickly that there were big blank spaces in your image that needed to be filled. So yes, so the point basically about using different lens sizes to create yes, here we go, extreme lens size, and so you're seeing far more of the surrounding architecture, and therefore far more of the blank spaces where there is none, and well, there is none architecture. Well, anyway, where there is no architecture surrounding. And so it's just necessary to populate that with something, or of course you could fill them in just by drawing those skyscrapers. But in this instance, to save time, I've elected to just do everything kind of in camera, if you like. And now I've imported the renders of those 3D images into Photoshop. And all I'm doing here really is I'm using the stamp filter to create a sort of kind of line drawing. That's not something that I would typically use for a published story or anything. I might use that as a starting point, but as I say, I tend to ink everything by hand and do a lot of penciling by hand as well. In this instance, it's just to act as a sort of to give you a general idea of how to actually use the camera settings in DAZ to create a basis for a comic book style image, and subsequent to using that stamp filter, it won't create a perfect line drawing. It will create a sort of black and white impression, but there'll be things that you want to tidy up. And normally we do this with practical materials, of course, but doing everything in Photoshop so that I can record it. So I'm adding outlines to some of these buildings where there are none, and erasing some of the superfluous detail on the architecture in order to just make for a sort of clearer, more striking image. This is the first of the 4 renders. This is the one that's intended as to demonstrate a slightly lackluster shot. As I said before, with a minimum of depth and interest and dynamism, just using using a lens size that's really more well suited to medium and close-up shots, and showing that how kind of ineffective that can be for a bigger establishing shot, particularly when that shot has to imply something. In this instance, there's nothing all that interesting going on in the image. It's just some traffic going down the street. So, in order that it serve as some kind of storytelling, there needs to be some implication from the kind of director, if you like, which in this case is the artist, of what these images actually mean, what the tone of them is. Cars going down a street is not going to interest people particularly, even if you shoot it from an unusual angle, unless that angle says something about what's going on. And in this instance, it doesn't really. So you get a very pedestrian, if you'll pardon the sort of pun, shot with no real emphasis on anything. I mean, the street's in the middle, so you assume that's important, but there's nothing really for the viewer to discern any sense of story or importance. Um, and I mean, you would only really use a shot like this maybe to demonstrate the formation that the cars were traveling in. If you were showing, for example, a police escort, but then if you're showing a police escort, you know, there's presumably a reason why there's a police escort, and shooting overhead wouldn't just demonstrate the formation. You would use that shot again to imply the presence of threat from any direction. The fact that a police escort is protecting the whoever they're escorting from some kind of outside danger. So you want to provide as much context as possible in the shot, and this kind of shot wouldn't really do that. You might communicate quite effectively the formation of the traffic, but there would be no real sense of what that people were being protected from anything of any great significance. Whereas when I move on to the shot with a wider angle lens, you'll see that there is a far greater sense of imposing architecture, and that architecture doesn't it's not necessarily that the drivers of the cars would necessarily face a threat from somebody behind one of those windows or anything. The architecture is more sort of symbolic of gigantic forces that may surround the occupants of the cars or the city and act beyond their control. I think I'm sort of coming to the end of this first one here, and it was mostly just like tweaking little lines and everything to make it look like more like an actual drawn or considered image rather than just an exported render put through a Photoshop filter, which of course is more or less what it was. But that's enough, I think, to illustrate a basic principle. Oh, adding shadows to the cars as well to give them some sense of depth rather than, rather than just being flat objects on the street. Now, I mean, it seems ironic that I'm going to all this trouble to add depth to an image where which is ostensibly demonstrating none. But you know, I'm trying to present this as close to how it would be if drawn like a comic book page as possible. And apologies if you can hear that sound in the background as well. That's my washing machine draining, something which I hadn't considered when setting up the keyboard, the laptop to record this. With any luck, my sink will hush in a moment. But in the meantime, it's very embarrassing. It sounds like I have some kind of gastrointestinal problem. And you know, how do you know I don't? This could be an elaborate ruse. There we go. It's back on some kind of regular cycle again. I really should have done this in another room. But maybe you can't hear any of that, and maybe I sound like somebody who's got some kind of brain problem. Yeah. So just touching up the cars here a little bit. Nothing really important. So maybe we should turn to a question from one of the Facebook people. Now, what's our first question today? Our first question comes from Cameron Foster, who's my brother. He says, if you're doing a perspective shot from above a skyscraper in an urban context, would you recommend a fisheye approach? And if so, do you have to explain how the fish got up there in a previous panel? Which touches rather neatly on the lens size issue, which I'm seeking to demonstrate. Obviously, my brother has, for comic effect, suggested that such a lens would require the presence of an actual fish in the narrative. But who knows, what kind of story you might want to tell. Maybe it would be about one that's a fish that's viewing a city from high up in the sky. It's a fairly boundless medium. But generally speaking, to answer your question with more seriousness than perhaps you'd like, it is kind of important to justify lens choices and camera positions, as I mentioned before. Just shooting a shot from a certain angle because you think it would be interesting is not really a reason to do it, because saying something is interesting is sort of a shorthand for saying I'm just doing it for the sake of it, really. If it's interesting, it will be interesting for a reason, and you can therefore give that reason rather than just saying it's interesting. So there generally has to be a purpose behind most shot choices. If you look at a director like Terry Gilliam, for example, he uses wide-angle lenses all the time in his films. There's nary a shot goes by in many of his films in which a wider angle lens than you would typically use is used, and that's done for the purposes of making the audience feel perpetually uncomfortable, uneasy, and slightly sort of disoriented, for the same reason he shuns conventional composition as well, and prefers to have the viewer have to find the important images in a shot rather than spoon feed them to the audience. And of course, you know, it's very commendable that a director is not speaking down to his audience, but at the same time, not necessarily commendable that he wishes them to feel uneasy and unpleasant for 2 hours straight. I don't know. I have mixed feelings about Terry Gilliam. You know, this is perhaps not the correct forum to vent those feelings, but you sort of get the general impression of where I'm coming from, I think. Now, let's see. What else do we have from our question box? Now, here's another one from Cameron Foster. He asks, with regards to skyscrapers, arguably the golden age of comics coincides with the high modernist aesthetic, and thus the visual lexicon that remains influential in graphic novels was developed when buildings had very specific properties. Given the relative simplicity of depicting the work of, say, Le Corbusier or that of Norman Foster, do you think there would be a tendency to represent urban spaces in an increasingly retro way, or will there have to be a new visual language developed? He notes that in Megacity 1, has quite a distinct architecture, and has seen scripts which called for angles that were not really consistent with the built environment. So clearly this is, or ought to be, a consideration for writers too. Megacity 1 there obviously being the hometown of Judge Dredd. Perhaps I should say the domain or dominion, whatever, of Judge Dredd, which is a character I'm probably most associated with, and he's correct. The formative, the sort of the iconic era of comics, the kind of silver age of comics, was characterized by, you know, increasingly modernist architecture and everything. There's still a lot of Art Deco buildings around. I think that's the Art Deco influence in architecture is very much felt in comic book art, particularly in something like Gotham City, which, I mean, obviously you would tend to think of as being sort of Gothic architecture, but I mean, Gothic architecture doesn't really allow for a modern metropolis. So you see sort of various artists doing their best to apply Gothic trappings to modernist and Art Deco types of skyscrapers with varying degrees of success. Um, and I think essentially what Cameron's point is that there tends to be a fairly simple geometric kind of grid system to the architecture involved in a lot of kind of comic book city scenes, which just by lucky haps is easier to plan out at the drawing stage. It's basically just a kind of extension of the perspective grid, whereas drawing sort of slightly more advanced or stylistic architecture would advanced is a sort of slightly derogatory term to use. It suggests that the modernist architecture was not as advanced, but slightly more. What might the word be? Maybe less conventional architecture, or less more detailed, more dynamic, expressive. All these things sort of confer a certain importance and generally suggest that less modernist architecture is better, and that's not what I mean to say at all. Regardless of how specifically I express it, the point remains that it's maybe less easy to depict certain types of architecture, particularly from dramatic angles and everything, without using 3D software like this. And even then, you would have to presumably build the architecture yourself in some kind of modeling program. Or, well, there goes the washing machine again, sorry. Let's try and put that to the back of our minds. Yeah, you would either have to build it from scratch, or download somebody else's model and use that, which may not be in line with what you want to do creatively. Kit bashing is usually the best alternative to modeling from scratch. Can often save you a lot of time. For those not familiar with the term, I assume most of you will be, but kit bashing is when you take it's actually more of a term that traditionally applied to the props industry and filmmaking, where they would take real objects, or found objects if you like, and cobble them together to make something new. The most famous examples being things like the lightsabers in the original Star Wars trilogy, which were made from like a flash gun from a camera, and all kinds of little pieces of hardware that were essentially glued together to make something which looks visually distinct. And you can do the same with 3D assets, so that you can create something that is fairly unique just by piecing together other pieces of 3D content. As long as you've got a sort of relative idea in your mind of how you want something to look, you'd be surprised at how efficiently you can find 3D models that will lend themselves quite well to creating the various components that you need, and often end up as a byproduct giving you more convincing or interesting detail on your models. But yeah, I'm kind of getting off topic a little bit. So yes, it does tend to be easier to convey architecture that conforms to a fairly simple grid system. But whether in a time where that's not so, where architecture is maybe certainly the skyscrapers and things have tend to veer towards more unusual designs and everything. I think that yes, probably the way that some cityscapes in comics will be depicted may change a bit as that progresses. But the changes in technology that are available to the comic book artist will aid that process. So I don't know that there'll ever have to be a kind of, you know, hard reset of how people do things. So the evolution of the two will kind of go hand in hand, I think, as has happened to some extent with other forms of engineering depicted in comics. Cars being the most obvious. Back in 60s comics and everything, cars tended to look fairly boxy and you know, not particularly streamlined or unusual in design, and that's because there were a lot of cars like that back in the 60s. Whereas now in comics, you'll see a lot more cars that conform to the modern standards of automobile design, with lots of curves and curved out headlights and everything. And those can be tricky to construct quickly, if you're not all that used to drawing them. But 3D modeling software and 3D posing software has lent a helping hand. So the innovations tend to kind of accompany each other. I actually also own a physical model of a car of that type, to use as a kind of reference tool as well. There are always ways to get around those things. I still quite like a boxy car now and again in comics, but yeah, I can see how they might be sort of losing relevance. But luckily, there are still plenty of modernist and Art Deco skyscrapers around. They don't tend to disappear as soon as fashion changes in quite the same way. Unless, you know, by some third party, but let's not go into that. But I mean, I suppose you just have to look to something like Gotham City for an example of why comics will never be really constrained to having to conform to the aesthetic standards of one particular time period. I mean, it all depends where the story's set. You know, just as there are Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four and all these characters who live in New York and will be set against that kind of geometric backdrop. There are also people like Thor, who, well, admittedly, a lot of his stories do take place in New York, but you know, there are plenty of comics characters who exist in Conan. There's another. There was a whole iconic era of comics before the sort of main Marvel universe came along, or sort of was reborn in the 60s. I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe the Conan comics were around the same time. But there's whole genres of comics. You know, Western comics and sort of jungle fantasy and science fantasy and science fiction set on other worlds and everything. Oh, I should mention what's going on screen at the moment, actually, because it is something that's not self-explanatory. Just to emphasize the sort of fisheye effect of the lens, I'm using a Sphere-Eyes filter in Photoshop. It's arguable how much difference it actually makes, but this was for the one where I thought I wanted to create a sense of vertigo, and I didn't feel that the wide angle lens was doing the job completely. So I've used a Sphere-Eyes tool, actually sort of kind of done it as an inverted kind of sphere, just to give that extra sense of distortion and dizzying height. But yeah, hopefully that works all right. Yes, I think I've probably wrung as much possible value as or given as lengthy and garbled an explanation or answer to that question as I possibly could. I apologise if it just seems like I'm rambling. But yeah, look at instantly you can see a dramatic difference in using a wider angle lens. You get so much more of the windows in shot, so much more of the surrounding buildings in shot as well, and it all starts to look a lot more overwhelming and slightly nauseating. Yeah, and generally I would say not necessarily a more compelling or dynamic image, but an image that gives a very distinct impression. You know, that is not just a typical establishing shot. There's clearly the director is trying to tell you something. I keep referring to like the director and everything, where of course, you know, all the artwork in this is just done by me. And in comics, you don't tend to think of there being a director and a cinematographer and you know, and actors and everything. But the comic book artist does take on the mantle of a lot of those people in the film industry. Obviously, doesn't face all the same challenges. You don't have to worry about locations and casting and all that stuff. You just sit down with your pencil or your graphics tablet or whatever it is you use and kind of create the things or cobble them together from things that from sources of inspiration, and generate things as close to your imagination as you can, without having to worry too much about budgets and things. But it does. You do have to. There are a lot of things you have to take into consideration, and directing is one of them. You know, shot choices and lens choices, and while they may be virtual, they all matter. And studying the visual language of filmmaking can be a great way to get a sense of how best to tell a story and how best to get around a certain problem. There's one challenge that the comic book artist faces, which film directors don't, which is that as well as composing individual images in a way which is interesting and there's me using that catch-all term, but in a way which helps tell the story and is visually engaging. There you go. You also have to figure out how those images are going to sit together on a page, and sometimes the composition of individual panels will be greatly affected by the other panels that surround them, which is not something that filmmakers typically have to worry about. They work with usually one size of or one aspect ratio in mind, which is what 16 by 10, whatever they actually shoot in CinemaScope and stuff. I'm not sure. But the comic book artist has lots of different aspect ratios to worry about most of the time. Back in the day, you used to maybe have most comics pages would have maybe 9 or 6 panels on them, all of equivalent size and shape. But now comic book layouts have changed quite a bit, and even back then, you know, a lot of the strips were not done in that simple grid fashion. So you've got to, you know, you have panoramic shots, you have shots that are in portrait, shots that are in landscape, shots that may have entirely unusual shots. It's unusual that you would tend to have a square shot like this, but sometimes it happens. You have shots that fill up the entire page, you have ones that maybe only take up 1/10 of it. If that. So trying to make multiple shots work on the one page is a quite a tricky thing often, and how you use your compositions and things like that to help tell the story will differ quite dramatically from filmmaking. But filmmaking can give you that little bit of an edge in terms of where you can kind of place the in quotes camera in order to get around a tricky little problem, like the shape of, like, for example, a problem that I come up against a lot is that I'll be reading a page, a script, and it'll there'll be maybe 6 panels on the page, and you have a certain amount of freedom as a comic book artist to say, right, well, I'm going to add an extra panel there to clarify that, or I'm going to merge these 2 panels into one if I think it will make for a more give the story more momentum, or I can put all the information into one image and make that a more dramatic and interesting image. But there are times where where the writer is right with how they've divvied up the action, and the pacing of it demands that there be the amount of panels that they have set out. And so say I'll get a script and I'll look at it and it's a 6-page panel, a 6-panel page, and upon reading the script I work out, I can see in my head how I want to shoot 5 out of the 6 panels, and what shape I want them to be, and how much of the page I want them to take up, and the writer will sometimes have intimated that they want 1 panel stretched across the whole horizontal axis of the page, or that they want 3 panels in quick succession of similar size or whatever. And you don't have to stick to that slavishly, but sometimes you will wholeheartedly agree that you want that big strap panel in the middle of the page, or a big establishing shot that takes up the top half of the page, or whatever. And therefore, when it comes to handling the remaining panels, sometimes there will be one where you just can't think of a composition for the shot that will convey all the necessary information and at the same time fit on, like literally fit onto the page, and that can be very tricky. But if you use filmmaking, if you take some of your cues from filmmaking, you can find ways of shooting scenes that get around problems like that. For example, I worked on a story recently that involved 2 characters getting out of a car and going into a building, and there was a shot, and the script said to the 2 characters, you can see the characters heading towards the building, and you can maybe see their car parked up the road in the background, so that you know so that you get a sense of continuity, because in the previous panel they were driving in the car. So the following panel of them heading towards a building, it would help the continuity of the story if you could actually see, that they had parked the car and got out of it. It would allow you to get a sense that one of what's the word? Not consequence in action, but that they'd gone from one event to the other. That this event was taking place directly after their car ride. And for a while, I couldn't figure out a way, because the way I had all the other panels on the page, I wanted I wanted quite a narrow panel, and then eventually I settled on a composition where I shot the 2 characters heading into the building through the window of the parked car. That allowed me to get the car in shot in such a way where I wasn't having to show a lot of background detail. I could keep everything central, but still make it quite compact and and show all the necessary information without anything being obscured. So that the fact that the car had the window in it, which obviously is transparent, and allows you to frame something with it, meant that I could have a whole bunch of things going on in the one shot, without you really visually kind of noticing that that's what I was doing. It might seem like a very obvious shot choice when you read the comic, but it was for me a piece of problem solver. How do I get two people and a car and a building, and a van that had to be parked outside as well, which I've got to mention? How do I get all of that into one shot, in a very kind of compact way, in quite a narrow panel? And that was my solution, and I thought it was quite successful. So anyway, I've moved on now to the last of these examples here in Photoshop, and this is the one where I'm just giving a sort of more of a generic establishing shot of a city bustling with activity. I've got the roads on either side of the buildings showing, you know, a sort of ebb and flow of traffic rather than just emphasizing one particular set of cars or focusing too specifically on the populace. Here you get a sense of buildings and people and cars and industry all working in a kind of mechanical way. You get a sense of sort of conveyor belts. It seems like a machine, and presumably a machine that's working reasonably efficiently, or at least fairly relentlessly. And that can be quite a powerful type of establishing shot. Again, I would recommend this one maybe more. This is maybe more of a filmmaking type of shot, because you can push the camera along, you know, if it's a helicopter shot or whatever, and get a sense of motion in there as well. Whereas for comics, it's maybe a little static. Again, directly overhead is an odd shot choice for a comic book panel. You'd maybe, the typical solution would probably be to show things from sort of diagonally from above, so you can get a more natural shot choice. That's more how you would tend to look at something. If you're high up, you tend not to look straight down, or if you're anywhere, you tend not to look straight down or straight up. So sort of three-quarter shots and diagonal shots tend to be a bit more convincing. Now, how long have we got left on this video here? Because there's not much left of the process, I don't think. Looks like there's ages. I mean, all of this last bit is just me compiling the images together and putting captions underneath, I think. Although it does illustrate the sometimes difficulty of getting your four images to work together on a page, even though this is for sort of instructional purposes and not a storytelling page. These are obviously all sort of intended as various iterations of the same image rather than sequential panels. I've still had to do a little bit of cropping and trimming and everything of these images to get them to have parity on the page. Presenting them as just squares wasn't going to work for me. This one had to be. I had in my brief that this was to be portrait, so I had to make my individual images portrait if I wanted to present them in a kind of window formation, and that meant cutting out some of the detail. So had to figure out which was the best way to crop them to keep all the essential detail in and keep the composition appealing. It's a bit boring, really, but a lot of being a comic book artist is quite boring. It's certainly quite boring to explain. Actually doing it, not that boring. I've spent a couple of years working as a professional comic book artist now, and I've experienced a great range of emotions and sensations, both physical and mental. And boredom has has not featured too prominently on the list, I must say. Make of that what you will, but it's certainly an interesting. There you go. This time employed intentionally, ambiguously, an interesting form of employment. Not necessarily the easiest to perform on a day-to-day basis, but it can be incredibly rewarding as well. I'm not going to sit here and bemoan my my career path, because as we all know, if I didn't want to do it, I could just go and do a far less competitive job instead. But I have elected not to do that, and until such times as I pack in this job and go back to working in a bar or a shop, then I can just bloody well keep my complaints to myself, and I have very few now. So yes, this is all very straightforward. What I'm doing now, it barely even qualifies as in any way tutorial. I'm just arranging the things on a page, all even and all exactly the same size and everything. Oh, thank God it's nearly the end of the commentary. You must be incredibly bored by this stage. It looks like there's still lots more of this to go. Why could that possibly be the case? I've got all my images, I've numbered them all, I'm about to put them all on the page. Jeez. I mean, obviously I could just stop talking at this point, but if you ever watch a director's commentary on a film and they just stop talking halfway through, you'd feel what's the word? Conned almost. And also, even when they stop talking, when the credits roll, I feel a little bit hard done by. Keep talking. There's still more. I mean, I would sit and watch the credits, and you want us to sit and watch the credits as filmmakers. So this is a 90-minute running time, including credits. Sit down and talk for the rest of the credits. There might not be anything interesting to say about them, but I mean, these are all the people who worked on your film. You must have some anecdote or something. Maybe one of them died, or one of them had an amusing habit that you could talk about, or maybe you snuck some joke credits in there for the benefit of yourself, and that now is the time to reveal those. I don't know, but for God's sake, don't just pitch up and leave as soon as the credit roll starts. Anyway, that's enough of that. Oh God, you can. I assume you can probably hear the washing machine now. It's now on the spin setting, which means we must be fast approaching the end of this commentary, because, as we all know, the events that take place in real life all kind of mirror each other like a kind of implied ticking clock. So I'm sure that when the time comes for the end of this commentary, the washing machine will have completed its cycle, in a sort of metaphoric gesture of I don't know. God, this isn't easy, sitting down and talking for an hour. I know I could go back to the bar. Right, well, there's all the images side by side. I'm about to name the lens sizes shortly, so that should at least confirm what I was speculating earlier about precisely what those lens sizes were and how they affected things. So that's something to talk about. I think the first one's the 65mm. That's the default in DAS. Second one, 30 millimeter, maybe even 20, and the next one's 10. I'm not sure. I used a pretty wide angle lens for them. Right, this one's 65. I'm pretty sure of that. Let's see. Type, man, come on. 65. Yes, 65 millimeter for the first one. I remember my own work. Well done. Oh, great! Now I've got to. Yeah, I should point out this one is maybe not sped up as much as some of the other tutorial videos. It was a far quicker exercise, but I fear I try and keep the tutorial videos at about an hour's length, just for some kind of consistency. Yeah, okay, 65 millimeters. The first one, I'm happy with that font, that typeface. Good. Next one, 20. Yes, excellent. My memory is working. Is this 10? Is this as small as 10? It is 10. Blimey, that's a. Oh yes, and distorted. That's a reference to the sort of the sphere-eyes effect I used in Photoshop just to give it that extra vertiginous quality. And this last one in 30, yeah, which is a sort of more standard wide-angle size that we use on an establishing shot like this, I think. But anyway, this must be the end. Must be nigh now. Not quite nigh. Forthcoming, but not nigh. Why? What am I doing? I'm just sitting there letting the cursor. It's almost like past me is taunting me. You've committed to this commentary, future Tom. You can just damn well sit there while I bet I went to the toilet or I'm checking Facebook or something, and as a result, I've left the camera thing or the recording software recording. Well, yeah, there we go. Okay, realigned. Great, that was worth waiting for, wasn't it? And then I go on to realign the text appropriately enough. Okay, this must be the end. I mean, seriously. Yes, okay, I can see it's coming up now. Well, thank you very much for joining me. If you've got any questions, God knows why you would at this stage, other than why, you can consult me on Twitter at JumbleCashback, JumbleCashback, or you can check out my DeviantArt account. That's listed in my bio in ImagineFX. But until I do another one of these commentaries, thank you very much for joining me. God, I don't know why you did, but I hope. But happy drawing or whatever, and I'll no doubt speak to you soon. Thanks very much, and goodbye.